Our next speaker, and this will be the last speaker before we have a break for refreshments, is Helen Hutchinson. Helen prepared the Mansion House Conservation Plan for the Council's first Mansion House bid for lottery funding back in 2004. So, over to you, Helen.
I've noticed that we're running a little ahead of time, but I'll try not to drag it out too much because we all need a cup of tea. Well, many thanks for inviting me to speak here today. I speak as an architect and not as a historian. My work is generally in the study and analysis of historic buildings and areas. And it's through understanding how they were built, how their plan, form and detail evolved, that I gain my understanding. And in this, I'm typically supported by parallel research into documentary sources. So with my other colleagues at Donald Insalls, we build a holistic understanding, attempting to define the essence of the place where we are working. That way, when we intervene in a historic building, we can work with it and avoid the risk of damaging its essential characteristics. As Donald Insall, our founder, says, we are working to ensure that we make each building more itself. And that is how I came to be involved with the Mansion House here at Doncaster through the production of the Conservation Plan back in 2003. Oh, having the same problem? So, what is a mansion house and how does it differ from a town hall or an assembly room? The Georgian era saw very considerable changes in local government and the creation of new buildings to house them. Until the 18th century, even Parliament and the government in London was housed in a series of rambling ancient buildings in and around Whitehall and Westminster. In the same way, local corporations like that at Doncaster operated out of churches or inns or private houses. Early town halls, like this example in Blandford, were often modelled on prototypes such as medieval guild halls or markets. The typical form was a meeting room supported on a colonnade which housed an open market beneath. Town halls were sometimes used for hosting entertainments, but it was still common practice to hire rooms in a local inn or private house. The town hall was primarily for meetings of the members, and it did not generally provide any accommodation for the mayor. In a few towns, a mansion house was built as well or instead of a town hall for the mayor to carry out his duties, of which we've heard a little already, to host formal dinners and entertainments, and sometimes as an official residence. The model for these buildings was that of a substantial townhouse, both in its appearance and its internal layout. I think there's a time delay on this, is that right? In England, it was York which boasts the first purpose-built mansion house, dating from 1730 to 1732. The plan of York's mansion house is essentially that of a large townhouse with a state room on the first floor. The mansion house at York is attributed to William Etty, who is known to have subscribed to William Kent's book, The Designs of Inigo Jones, published in 1727. As you will see as my talk progresses, there are strong similarities between the plan of York and that of Doncaster. The most outstanding Georgian mansion house has already been mentioned, that in London, designed by George Dance the Elder in 1737 and completed in 1752, just after Doncaster's house. In this example, the plan form is derived from designs by Andrea Palladio for a large palazzo around an internal courtyard. The front elevation in London resembles contemporary country houses, while the side elevations and the dramatic rooftop pavilions perhaps hark back to Inigo Jones's Wilton House, built about 100 years previously. So, you will have noticed now that I've referred to Andrea Palladio and Inigo Jones on a few times. So it's perhaps time to look briefly at their influence on the architecture of James Paine. Palladio was an Italian architect of the mid-16th century, and he stood out among his contemporaries because he rejected the very complex and elaborate mannerism of architects such as Michelangelo. Instead, he looked back to Vitruvius. Vitruvius was an ancient Roman author whose work had been rediscovered in the 1400s and which was a major inspiration for the early Renaissance architects. Palladio published a book called The Four Books of Architecture, which had wide influence in the centuries following, both within and beyond Italy. You can see here at the top one of his most famous buildings, the Villa Rotunda. It employs pure geometric forms and a very restrained use of classical orders. It has a deceptive simplicity and repose. Inigo Jones was an English architect. He was a solitary trailblazer for Palladio's style here in the years before the English Civil War. Renaissance architecture up until then had had a very limited impact in this country and had generally been a pick and mix approach applied to essentially Elizabethan buildings. Jones was the architect for the Queen's House in Greenwich, which you see here at the bottom, and also the Banqueting House in Whitehall. He was looking back to Palladio's work of the previous century. Sorry. After the restoration of the monarchy, it was the Baroque style, which was popular throughout mainland Europe, which prevailed for most buildings of significance in England. This style is exemplified in the work of architects such as Wren, Hawksmoor and Vanbrugh. And here you can see Castle Howard, designed by John Vanbrugh in the early years of the 18th century. A highly energetic and elaborate building. In contrast, there was a sudden change of fashion in around 1715, which coincided with the start of the Georgian era. 2 books were published that year. One was a translation of Palladio's 4 Books of Architecture, and the other was a book titled Vitruvius Britannicus by Colin Campbell. This new trend had the effect of turning the architectural clock back by 100 years, starting again where Inigo Jones had left off. And the next generation of architects made the Palladian revival their own. Among its key proponents were Robert Taylor, John Carr of York, the 2 John Woods of Bath, and of course, James Paine. By the 1750s, the impact of archaeology became a factor in architectural taste, and neoclassicism began to displace the Palladian style. Controversy raged over the merits of Roman or Greek design. The Greek was seen by opposing sides as either pure or primitive, and the Roman as either sophisticated or decadent. But some architects chose simply to take inspiration from any source to suit their clients' tastes. Among these were Robert Adam, followed as the century progressed by architects such as James and Samuel Wyatt and Henry Holland. All of these architects took elements of the Palladian tradition and adapted it to incorporate new ideas emerging from the study of Greek and Roman buildings outside of Italy. And we can see here a building, Kedleston, which was originally designed by Paine, but the client was impressed by the work of Robert Adam and put Robert Adam in charge of the work in place of Paine. And you can see in the middle of this elevation, the columns are supporting a kind of parapet with figures, and this is designed to replicate a triumphal arch in Rome. And poor James Paine suffered the indignity of many of his houses being redecorated by Robert Adam within his own lifetime. Towards the close of the 18th century, architects were combining the elements of classicism in new ways, and the Regency style began to emerge. This was increasingly eclectic, with inspiration from Gothic and the picturesque, and rapidly changing social conditions too. So we've already heard a little bit about James Paine himself and the context in which he worked. He combined his northern practice here in Yorkshire, where he designed something like 30 country houses, with London-based appointments. Among these was the clerk of work to the Queen's House in Greenwich. So once again, that connection with Inigo Jones is coming up again. He took a grand tour in Italy and was inspired by seeing the buildings of Palladio and other Renaissance architects as his inspiration. He seems to have been singularly unimpressed by the Roman remains themselves. The other key architect for the mansion house here in Doncaster was William Lindley. Lindley was born in 1739 and died in 1818. He began as an assistant to John Carr in York, where he worked for around 20 years. He was responsible for several public buildings here in Doncaster, including a theatre, a jail, and the grandstand at the racecourse. He designed and remodelled several houses in Yorkshire and the adjoining counties. And among his surviving buildings here in Doncaster is his own house in South Parade. This elegant terrace would not look out of place in Cheltenham or any other fashionable town of the period. His designs could be described as rather conservative, perhaps suited to the tastes of his provincial clients and their more modest means. Throughout his life, he continued to work in the style he had learnt from John Carr and had much in common with the tastes of Robert Adam. And the last known architect to be involved here at the Mansion House was William Hurst. He was born in 1787 and lived into the Victorian era, dying in 1844. He was born in Doncaster and trained under William Lindley. And after Lindley's death, the practice took the name Woodhead and Hurst. Hurst was also a town councillor and in 1827 was mayor of Doncaster. As you probably know, Doncaster has Roman origins, sitting at the crossing of the River Don on the route from Lincoln to York. This same site was chosen by the Normans for the construction of the long-lost Doncaster Castle, and the medieval town grew up mainly to the east of the castle, clustering along the High Street, the Great North Road, and around the marketplace. Within the town limits, there was a Franciscan friary to the west and a Carmelite friary to the south. And these areas of land remained undeveloped for a long period of time. Georgian Doncaster was a medium-sized market town on the coaching route linking London, York and Edinburgh. It was home to the racecourse where the famous St Leger was first held in 1778. At that time, the town corporation was based in the former St Mary's Church in the marketplace, and events were held in rented premises such as houses and inns. But by the 1730s, this was considered inadequate. A new building would allow grand entertainments and increase the town's attraction for the gentry and other visitors, so boosting prosperity. So land was bought here on the south side of the High Street in a garden formerly occupied by the Carmelite Priory. The young architect James Paine was appointed around 1744. Work commenced the following year and was completed by 1749. Paine's original design was highly ambitious. It had a large central block with the main entrance sequence and the first floor banqueting hall. It had 2 flanking wings with ancillary accommodation, a typical Palladian design as seen on a larger scale in so many country houses, but here compressed to an urban site. His designs for the mansion house were never fully implemented. The corporation, counting their pennies, did not purchase the adjoining houses on the High Street, and so could not implement the flanking wings. However, the main central block and the magnificent kitchen wing to the rear was completed and closely follows the designs published by Paine soon after its completion. The plan was compact and elegant in its simplicity. Paine was well known for his ability as a designer, creating well-planned, manageable houses catering to the needs of the minor aristocracy. He was also admired for his ability to design staircases, a very complex 3-dimensional exercise, and both of these talents are evident in the mansion house. The front of the building is dominated at first floor by this large ballroom where we're sitting today. Behind it are the main stair, and as you see on this plan, originally a service stair, as well as ancillary rooms for card playing and withdrawing after dinner. Linked to the building via a colonnade was the great kitchen. The exterior of the mansion house, facing onto the High Street, is a fine example of the Palladian Revival style. It is balanced and calm in contrast to the Baroque designs of the earlier era. The rusticated base supports a tall first floor and has paired columns in the composite order, supporting originally a wide pediment. The central window that you can see here on the drawing and flooding the room with light is designed in the form of a Venetian window or serliana, an arched opening flanked by narrow rectangular openings. This feature marks the central axis of the building and is repeated throughout the interior and the staircase. You will see on this drawing that the rusticated base has a central doorway flanked by columns. If you go and look outside, you'll see that the ground floor is in fact rather squat compared to what Paine drew here, with a shallow arch over the door instead of the entablature. The similarities between this design and for the mansion house and the unexecuted design by Inigo Jones for Whitehall Palace are very striking. Today, plagiarism might be scorned, but the use of published sources as an inspiration was accepted practice in those days. By doing so, the architect and the building were elevated by association with a past master. The interior of Palladian Revival buildings varied in their decorative treatment. They were attempting to imitate Roman precedents, for which at the time there was no evidence. The spaces were designed in mathematical proportions, influenced by classical and Renaissance precedent, and this room here has the timeless and elegant proportions of a double cube. We can see here the published scheme for the decoration of this room, which is highly ornate and Baroque in its character, with heavy flowing scrolls, swags and drapery, figures and billowing clouds. But the decoration we see around us as implemented was less elaborate and Rococo in character, flowing and energetic, but rather more restrained. The main focus of the decoration is this room and the main staircase, with the ceiling in here as a particular climax with its dramatic eagle. But the same architectural character continues throughout the whole building. As you walk around, you will have seen other Rococo details, such as in the ceiling of the drawing room and in the lamp brackets downstairs. The interior and exterior of Paine's design form a seamless whole. You can see here how the main elevation and the interior of the ballroom share the same architectural treatment. Ooh. You could also see the same by looking out of the window, where the columns outside and inside share exactly the same detail. The mansion house has great architectural integrity. Many neoclassical buildings, the interior and exterior do not relate to each other and require the use of blind windows in order to force symmetry onto the elevation. So here are the plans of Paine's building as it was originally completed. On the ground floor were various offices and the very large kitchen to the rear reached via the covered corridor. Visitors would mount the imperial stair, which splits and turns back on itself, leading directly to the ballroom. Either side are the drawing rooms, and at the side, a small service stair. 60 years passed before substantial alterations were made to the mansion house, and these were designed by the architect William Lindley. First, in 1800, Lindley was commissioned to remove the pediment and replace it with an attic story crowned with urns and the corporation's arms. This was carried out in 1801, and it's thought that the stonework was rendered over and painted at the same time. When seen from inside the roof space, we can see that the most of the pediment is actually still in place, with the new windows built on top. You can see on the right here Lindley's work, and you'll perhaps notice the similarities to what Adam did to Paine's building at Kedleston, creating the form of a Roman building. Until this time, the plot to the west of the mansion house, where Paine had planned one of his two symmetrical wings, was occupied by a house of 17th century appearance, which you can see in the left-hand image. The corporation bought the old house and planned for its demolition. A new house facing the High Street was completed and occupied by 1805, which you can just see creeping into the picture on the right. In 1806, a new first-floor dining room was built at the back of the mansion house, also by Lindley. The new dining room is longer and narrower than the ballroom, not as tall, but with elegant proportions. It's decorated in a light Regency style with dainty geometrical mouldings, in contrast to the flowing Rococo decoration work of Paine. So we see here the building as it was completed by Paine, and then the house and Lindley's alterations of 1806. At ground floor, the kitchen link was replaced and a new stair was created. One drawing room was enlarged to create the saloon we see upstairs today. You will see that as part of this work, the mansion house was expanded outside its original plot and became interlinked with the new house. Lindley was careful to reinforce the classical rules of space planning in his work, and he created a new secondary axis with the dining room centred on one of the side doors to the ballroom, creating an enfilade with long views throughout the building. Around 1830, a new side street was created running south from the High Street, named Priory Place after the Carmelite Friary. The garden behind the mansion house was used for the development, and the street was filled with a terrace of houses by Woodhead and Hurst. You can see here number 1, which is the house built in 1806 on the High Street, and then number 2 and number 3 going down the side street. So this was the building in 1806, and then with the addition of the houses on Priory Place. These two are interlinked with the mansion house, and you can see that number 3 has no staircase of its own. Rather, it uses the stair built in 1806 to link the great kitchen with the dining room. This house might have been occupied by a housekeeper and a butler to the mansion house, or it may have provided offices for the town clerk. They also added windows to the side of the previous house onto the new street. This map of 1851 shows amazing detail, including the interior of public buildings, and you can see the entire floor plan of the mansion house and 3 Priory Place. The use of these domestic buildings to support the mansion house points to the strength of Paine's original design with his side wings. I wonder if anyone in the town corporation regretted not being bolder back in the 1740s when they had the chance to build his whole scheme. Then they wouldn't have had to mess about with the houses on Priory Place to get the accommodation they needed. The last significant alterations to the mansion house were undertaken in 1864. A link was created across the back of the mansion house, behind the main stair, creating a space known as the buffet. And for those of you who were here before, that's where the musicians were standing. The Venetian window that lit the main stair was moved backwards, and a new opening in the same Venetian form was created to allow light and views to flood through into the staircase. It's not known who the architect for this work was. Intervening in this part of the mansion house was bold, but it was carefully done. They retained the central axis of symmetry, the flow of light, and repeated the use of the Serliana motif. This extension is at first floor only and is supported below by 4 cast iron columns. Now, from this point in time onwards, work to the building can only be described as ad hoc tinkering. In some years, at some point towards the end of the 19th or early 20th century, some gentlemen's toilets were constructed below the staircase, encapsulating 2 of the iron columns. And the house at number 2 Priory Place was extended to fill in the courtyard. The 20th century saw only very modest changes. Sheds and outhouses were built in the small yard areas. Flues and ducts rather sadly mar the courtyard walls. Down in the cellar, corrugated iron was used to create an air raid shelter. More importantly, the mansion house took on more and more functions associated with a town hall. Rooms changed their functions, with the dining room for a long time being used as the council chamber. The most attractive contribution of the 20th century is perhaps the Peace Window, commemorating the International Year for Peace in 1986. And so here we are, back in the present day. The mansion house is listed Grade 1 and is therefore recognised as a building of outstanding national importance. The main frontage onto the High Street is a design of exceptional quality. Although altered from Paine's original concept by an architect of lesser importance, the resulting elevation has a scale and dignity rare in a Georgian market town. At the back of the property is the great kitchen, which retains much of its original form. The survival of any grand kitchen of this era is quite remarkable, most having been lost or changed in the intervening centuries. The complex interrelationship of spaces and interior detailing represented by the mansion house remains undiminished in the nearly 2.5 centuries since it was completed. We've seen how Lindley's dining room created another layer of complexity while respecting the original design. And so too, the creation of the buffet respected the original spatial qualities and the important lighting on Paine's staircase. The building is a fusion of neoclassical, Regency and Palladian. The continuity of the classical tradition is a crucial part in the evolution of the mansion house. Paine's design survives substantially complete, and the architecture of the interior remains undiminished. And so here we are today, celebrating the survival of this fantastic building, the vision of the people of Doncaster, and above all, the legacy of James Paine's remarkable talent. Thank you very much. So I think we've got a few minutes before the coffee break. If anybody wants to ask me any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Yes?
Could you say a bit more about the similarities between the Mansion House at York and the Mansion House here? You mentioned that at the beginning, and I'd be interested to know
Yes.
what the connections are.
Well, in terms of... Let's whiz back to the plan of York. Ooh, keep going. Nearly there. So you can see the plan is almost identical. The only difference at York is that they had a bit of extra width, and you can see that carriageway passage to the rear. In every other respect, the layout is identical, apart from the staircase, where Paine's design is an imperial stair where you go up and then double back on yourself. I think it's probably that the functions were essentially the same. We can't know whether James Paine copied this building. He must have been aware of it because it was built in the 1730s. He was working for John Carr in York at that time. He must have known of the building. I think, as I said, this is attributed to Etty, who subscribed to books illustrating Inigo Jones's work. So certainly their inspiration was the same. I think it would perhaps be unfair to assume that James Paine copied the Mansion House in its plan from York. He certainly developed the plan and made it more sophisticated. I haven't had the opportunity to visit York, so I can't comment on which is the better, but I'm sure this one is.
I come from York, so you wouldn't expect me to agree. I suppose what was behind my question was this. My understanding is that this Mansion House is unique in its function or the purpose for which it was used. So, which is, I may be wrong here, more of a sort of assembly room than the traditional Mansion House use, which is the York one. So
the York one was that used very much as a mayor's residence rather than specific. Not that I'm aware of. There doesn't seem to be much in the way of domestic accommodation here. After the attic story was built, one of the rooms up there at the back, certainly in later times, was known as the mayor's bedroom. But whether that's where he went after a rather heavy night or whether he actually lived there is quite a different question.
But that's what makes this one special.
Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, at the back.
There are remains of the Carmelite Priory downstairs in the gents' toilet and below the Priory suite. Is there any record of whether any of that Priory was demolished in order to make space for the Mansion House, or had it already gone?
That's a very good question, which I'm afraid I can't answer. It's possible that people here in the Archives Service might have more information about historic records or maps, or perhaps what buildings occupied this site before the corporation bought it and built the Mansion House. So you're absolutely right, there are remains down there, but I can't shed any more light on it. Sorry. Yes, gentleman at the back.
Has any paint analysis been undertaken during the works that you've been involved with here, that you might understand how the planes of decoration were originally intended?
That's something that we would very much love to do. But when we were doing the work back in the early 2000s, it was really to try and get the ball rolling. And I'm sure that's an objective for the future. If funding becomes available, it would be a marvellous thing to do. And the lady there. Yes, that's right. But if you go up into the roof space, you can see the triangle of stone with a very shallow rake and then other masonry on top of it. And where there's the 3 windows along the front, the 2 at the side sit on top of where the pediment was, and the one in the middle is punched through it. But I assume that all the mouldings and the cartouche that sat within the pediment at the front must have been knocked off and taken away to allow for the smooth parapet frontage. So there's no record of where that stonework might have gone. Perhaps in somebody's rockery. Yes, another gentleman at the back.
I'm just harking back to the comparison between this mansion house and York, where
Yes.
York's was always providing accommodation for the Lord Mayor. Obviously, Paine's original vision was to have those 2 flanking pavilions.
Yes, that's right.
Do we know, were they to provide accommodation for the Lord Mayor? Do we know what Paine or anyone else had in mind for those 2 sort of separate pavilion spaces? Or did it never get that far in the...
Well, they were, in their layout, they look very domestic, although I think I saw somewhere, possibly an exhibition outside, suggesting that it was offices for the town clerk and some other kind of official. But the layout of the buildings would certainly suggest that they could have been used for residential purposes. There's lots of doors. I mean, they don't look like houses in terms of their elevational treatment. They're very much kind of wings. But that wouldn't have stopped them being used as domestic purposes. And I could well imagine over the years, if they had been built, that would have been a perfect use for them, absolutely. Yes, lady by the fireplace. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Oh yes. Yes, the eagle there. Ah, okay. So this was the scheme as published. And so from the cornice line there, which is highlighted in gold and white, he envisaged the ceiling arching in, and all the area that is plain would have had these swirls and swags and billows. I think the main difference between the Baroque and the Rococo is that the Baroque is very, very energetic and fluid and bends and breaks the rules of classicism as much as it can without them actually disintegrating. Whereas the Rococo it takes a step back and is a little bit more subtle. The Baroque almost seeks to dominate the architecture, whereas Rococo design, certainly in this country, tends to be more restrained and sit within the architecture rather than being part of the main architectural scheme. Although if there's architectural historians in the room, you might pick me up on that. Well, if there's not any more questions, perhaps I'll hand back to our host, Bob. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Very, very enlightening. Thank you very much. And